G'day, I'm Wiz and welcome back to Auslan Studios. Today's tutorial is looking at routing on the aw4416. It's a question that comes up continuously on the news groups and is one of the most difficult things to understand about the aw4416. It's very flexible and it's also very complicated. So let's have a look at the tutorial and I'll see you at the end. The aw4416 is a fantastic machine, endlessly flexible, but with that flexibility comes a level of complexity. The aw4416 certainly hasn't been aimed at the newbie home recordist. With some time and effort though, the AW can become your best friend instead of your arch enemy. The aw4416 is essentially a complete recording studio in a box. The AW comes standard with 8 preamps and A to D converters. It has a 24 input mixer. It has 2 expansion slots where you can purchase optional cards like an MY8AT card, which gives you 8 channels of ADAT-IO, A to D or D to A cards, or even a Waves Y56K card which has some of the Waves plugins as well as an ADAT-IO on board. So the design architecture of the AW is a 24 input mixer feeding a 16 track hard disk recorder followed by a 16 channel monitor mixer, all feeding a stereo bus. So aside from the 8 preamps and A to D converters, it has compressors and EQs on just about every input and output, 2 complete effects units and 4 assignable Omni outputs. Combine this with the AW's ability to route just about anything to anywhere, and things are going to get a little complicated. The best way for me to explain routing is to just show the typical setup for a particular song. Remember though, and it bears repeating over and over again, that the basic design of the AW is a 24 input mixer feeding a 16 track hard disk recorder followed by a 16 channel monitor mixer, all feeding a stereo bus. The instrumentation on this particular song is going to consist of drums, bass guitar, 2 electric guitars, an acoustic guitar, 1 vocal part, and a stereo Hammond B3 part. The time to start planning for mixdown is right now. Use a logical sequence during your setup and your planning stage, and everything will flow freely from there. So with that in mind, I'm going to mark up the desk like this. I'll have 4 tracks of drums, starting with overhead left and overhead right, followed by the kick drum, the snare drum, then we'll have the bass guitar, then I'd like the acoustic guitar, then I'd like the Stratocaster guitar, followed by the Les Paul, then my vocal, and then the stereo B3. This gives us a total of 11 tracks for this song. Seeing though the AW comes standard with 8 preamps and A to D converters, I thought it makes sense to split this up into 2 sessions, with the first session us recording the first 8 tracks, and the second session overdubbing the vocals and the B3. So our first step is to plug everything we need to into the AW. I think it's best to set things up with mixing in mind. Follow a logical sequence with your patching and routing and life will be a lot easier. I would make my connections like this. The overhead left mic cable would go into the first AW preamp, AD1. Overhead right into AD2. The kick drum would then be plugged into AD3, the snare drum into AD4, the bass guitar DI into AD5, the acoustic guitar into AD6, the Stratocaster into 7, and the Les Paul into 8. The reason the drum overhead mics have been plugged into AD1 and AD2 is to take advantage of phantom power. The mics that I'm using for the drum overheads require phantom. So then I would label my desk so it looks like this. With the AW, you can always be guaranteed that there's more than one way to do something, and that goes true with routing. You could use the quick record function, but I suggest you don't do that. I suggest that you get to learn to use the setup patch in page. It's a place where you can view all the connections you need to in one spot. So we need to push the setup button followed by the F1 function key. The setup patch in screen is where you decide which A to D converter preamp combination or which of the option slot inputs, if you have option slot cards, are routed to which mixer channels. You then decide which mixer channels will feed the hard disk recorder inputs. Hard disk recorder tracks 1 through 16 always feed monitor channels 1 through 16. You don't have any control over that, so you don't have to worry about it. On the screen you can see at the moment that mixer channel 1 has AD1 assigned to it, mixer channel 9 has slot 1 assigned to it, and mixer channel 17 has slot 2 assigned to it. As we plug the left overhead mic into AD1, that would mean that with this setting, it's routed to mixer channel 1. If I was to change this to AD3, what do you think would be routed to mixer channel 1? That would be the kick drum microphone. If you don't understand that, maybe stop the video for a second and have a think. As we continue to scroll through the options available to us with mixer channel 1, we can see that we can send any of the options slots, the SPDIF left and right inputs, the metronome, or any of the 8 sample pads. But what we want is we want mixer channel 1 to have AD1, mixer channel 2 to have AD2, mixer channel 3 to have AD3, and so on through to channel 8. Now let's cursor down to the bottom of the screen where we have our recorder track input assigned section. This is where we decide what we will send to each of the 16 hard disk recorder tracks. The options that we have available to us here are direct 1 through 16 and bus 1 through to 8. We're going to use direct. You would use bus if you wanted to combine more than one instrument to one track at a time, not something that I generally do. Direct 1 would mean that it gets its signal directly from mixer channel 1. Direct 2 would mean that it gets its signal directly from mixer channel 2. So what we want to do is set up hard disk recorder track 1 to get its signal from direct 1, hard disk recorder track 2 to get its signal from direct 2, and so on through to 8. Now push the utility button, followed by the F2 key. Remembering that we set the hard disk recorder track inputs to direct 1 through 8, we now have to decide the direct out extract position. If you cursor across here, you will see that you have 3 options: pre-EQ, pre-fader, and post-fader. For the way I like to work, I leave it set at pre-fader. This will be the subject of another tutorial on what these 3 things mean. For the moment, leave it set there, and if you're really keen, you could read the reference manual on that particular section. At this point, it's a good time for gain staging. Get the band to run through the song, adjust your preamp controls so that as the instrument is playing at its loudest point, it only just lights the peak light, and then you back it off just a hair and you're all good to go. Now you need to press Home and the input layer and turn on the first 8 channels. Now arm the first 8 tracks of the hard disk recorder. Now push the Home button followed by the Monitor layer button. Now turn on the first 8 monitor channels. Have the band run through the song, and you can set up a monitor mix, knowing that any fader or pan changes you make here are post hard disk recorder and have absolutely no impact on the recording whatsoever. Set up your monitor mix how you like it, hit record, and record your song. With the basic tracks out of the way, it's time to overdub the vocals and the keyboards. Unplug everything and then repatch your vocal lead into AD1 and your B3 into AD2 and 3. In the Setup Patch In page, make sure that channel 9 of the mixer input assign is set to AD1, channel 10 is to AD2, and channel 11 is to AD3. Your hard disk recorder settings should be track 9 to direct 9, track 10 to direct 10, and track 11 to direct 11. Turn on monitor layer channels 9, 10 and 11 so you can hear your new instruments, and make sure that the only input mixer channels that are on are 1, 2 and 3, the 3 things that we're recording. Gain stage appropriately, and then you're all set to go. Well, I hope that gets you up and going. It's quite a difficult subject, and it's been a very difficult process making this tutorial, trying to make it as clear as possible. I hope I've covered enough to help you understand routing on the aw4416, or at the very least to encourage you to get in there and have a go. Remember, the reference guide is always there to help you. Please check out my website www.auslandmusic.com, where you can find some information about how I recorded my album. There's lots of tips and photos and things there. You can also pick up a copy of the album if you don't have one, which I encourage you to do. And until next time, happy tracking.
Welcome to the Yamaha aw4416 tutorial video. Here we have the front panel of the aw4416. Up top you see the gain knobs for the analog inputs. Gain knob number 8 does both the high Z input as well as the mic input. Here you have a separate monitor out volume level and a headphone volume level. These knobs here are panning and EQ for a selected channel or input. On the left-hand side of the screen, we have the Work Navigate buttons, the Song button, where you make new songs and edit the song general parameters. You have Unit buttons, which are the Setup and File buttons. There's a Mixer section. We have the fader mode, in other words, what job are the faders doing? And then at the bottom, the mixing layer. You have a home button right here above fader number 1, very important. And then the mixing layer buttons, which tell the faders what job they're doing. Here we have the 16 faders. Above each fader is an on button and a select button, so that you can select the fader input or track for some sort of editing. All the way over to the right of fader number 16, you have a solo button. To the right of that, and at 4 o'clock from the data dial, of course, is the enter button. These faders do many jobs. They're input faders, they're output faders, they're send faders, depending on the job you've assigned them to do. Coming over underneath the screen, you have F buttons that change the screens that you're going to be looking at. It changes the tabs. You have the sample pad buttons, which control where your samples, if you have any samples, are going to be located in 8 banks, A and B. We've already talked about the EQ buttons. This is the screen LCD contrast button. To the right of that, you see the level meters. You'll notice that you have a ABS button that you can choose from there, and also a peak hold if you wish to retain the highest level that your meters hit. Below that are the red track arming buttons. Below that, we have the track buttons and the edit for that. We have automation, scene, memory, recall, store, and up and down through the numbers of the scene memories. At the far right, you have the 4-way cursor to navigate around the screen. The big data knob, which is used to change values and make selections, the outside ring of which is a jog, so you can jog by pre-selected increments through the song. Below that is the 16 key pad. These keys are going to be involved in auto punch, laying markers down and searching through those markers, fast forward, rewind, as well as a return to 0 button, which takes you to the beginning of the song. Below that are the transport controls, and they look just like transport controls on any tape deck or recording device. Welcome to the Yamaha aw4416 tutorial video. In the utility screens, that's button number 3 in the unit area, press F3 and go immediately to utility number 2. The only thing you really need in the utility screens is the CD-DAT digital record, and that must be enabled and the copyright disclaimer agreed to in order to permit you to import CDs or WAV files saved on CDs into song files on the AW. Welcome to the Yamaha aw4416 tutorial video. On the third row of buttons on the AW, we have the View button, possibly the most powerful button on the console for just seeing all of the parameters and everything you've done to an individual input or channel. You simply select the input or channel or track that you want to look at, press the view button, and you can see everything about it. You can see your sends, you can see what buses it's assigned to if it is an input. If the EQ is on, it lets you know what the graph is on the EQ, whether the dynamics are on. And you can go down all of your channels simply by hitting the select buttons. The view screen will show you in the upper left-hand corner, just like all the other screens, it lets you know where you are navigating-wise. It shows you the last selected channel or track. The second page of view shows you a little bit more data, but basically the first page is the one that you want. But you can actually, save settings once again. Welcome to the Yamaha aw4416 tutorial video. The next section we're going to look at is the Dynamics section. Dynamics on their first menu shows you the edit page with all the different parameters that you can change using the data dial, and there's also a on-off button to turn the Dynamics processor on and off. You can do that manually with the effect dial, or you can just press the enter button and it will automatically toggle it for you. On the second page of Dynamics is your Dynamics library. These are presets that you can recall and apply to the selected channel. You also have meters in the upper right-hand side. Those meters are called GR for gain reduction, and also it gives you the track meters on the right-hand side for the output from the Dynamics processor. aw4416 tutorial video. This is the first video in a series of many for this particular product. We're going to start now with the back panel, and basically starting at the left-hand side of the small recorder console, we're going to identify all of the jacks and parts. These are inputs 1 and 2. They are a little bit different than the rest of the 6 analog inputs because they have inserts on them, as well as having phantom power. The other 8 inputs do not have phantom power, although they are balanced microphone level and work perfectly fine for dynamic mics. That covers from this part of the back panel all the way over to here. You will notice on input number 8, it's a little bit different. It has a high Z input as well. This is suitable for passive instruments such as bass guitars that require a high impedance input in order to sound correctly. On the lower row of jacks, we have stereo out on RCA connectors. We have the monitor out on unbalanced 1/4 inch. We have assignable Omni outs on unbalanced 1/4 inch. We have a foot switch jack. This foot switch can be used to operate the transport and essentially put you in and out of record if you need. Above that is the headphone jack. Next to it are the digital stereo outs. The only thing that goes to the digital stereo outs is the stereo bus. These are the main outputs, and it is a SPDIF format. Below the digital stereo outs, we also have the mouse connector. This connector is for not a PS2 mouse or a modern mouse. It's for an old serial mouse. It is the only one that will work in this particular connector. PS2 mice with an adapter will not work. Above here we have the word clock in and out for synchronizing the sampling frequencies on digital devices. Here we have the SCSI port. Very few hard drives are available for the SCSI port in this particular format or any other SCSI port, so we don't advise, really even pursuing, the attachment of that. To the left of that, there is a host connector. This is a DIN plug that takes a special 9-pin cable. Very few computers at this point actually have that type of connector on them. And this port puts out MIDI. Since the AW does not record MIDI as such, it's just for MIDI commands, MTC, that sort of thing. Below there, we have the traditional MIDI in, out, and through. The third jack is for MIDI timecode. If you are synchronizing the AW transport, playback, or record, either as a master or slave, for the timecode itself, it is preferable to use that particular jack rather than either the MIDI in or out. Below the physical input jacks, we have 2 card slots. As you can see, there's a TDIF card in slot number 1. These slots are for digital inputs and outputs. You cannot mount an additional hard drive card there. The hard drive is in the 3rd slot, and this unit allows you to have 1 hard drive on board at any one time. These are IBM TravelStar hard drives, 64 gig max, 4200 RPM. We'll talk a little bit later about replacement of drives, including the CDRW. To the left of the hard drive slot, there is the internal fan, which must remain unblocked and running at all times to keep the unit cool. Welcome to the Yamaha aw4416 tutorial video. In the second line of buttons on the left-hand side of the screen, we have the unit area. The first button in unit underneath song is setup. This is very important. This is where you make the decisions on what goes to what channel of your mixer. If you have option cards in your slots, you can route those to channels 1 through 16 or 17 through 24. The default and what most people use is simply AD1 through AD8 for the analog inputs that come in the back panel stock. At the bottom of this screen, you have the recorder track input assign. This is what changes when you use Quick Record. It assigns channel directs to the tracks rather than the buses, which are the most versatile. You simply assign a bus to an input channel and it will go to the appropriate track. Any input channel can go to any track by doing this, rather than being essentially hardwired by using the directs. On the second menu on setup, you have the output patch. The Omni-outs on the back panel have their assignments here. Auxiliaries 1 through 4 are the defaults. However, you may have extra speakers or something else that you wish to assign to those outputs, and this is where you make that selection. You'll also see you have your slot output patches if you are recording on this machine and also sending signal out the slots to some other digital device. The fourth menu is the word clock menu. Normally you never have to go here. But if you are clocking, for example, in our case, we have a Tascam card in one of the slots. If you are trying to clock your word clock to that input, this is where you will do this. Typically, it's going to be set for internal, and it's going to be 44.1 kHz. The machine will run at 48 kHz, but if you're planning on burning a CD on the aw4416, you will not be able to do it until that file has been format converted. You will also notice what appears to be a vary speed down on the word clock area. Leave that set for fixed. Even though you may vary speed it down to 42 kilohertz, when you go to actually burn your CD, it will clock itself back up and now your song will sound fast. Welcome to the Yamaha aw4416 tutorial video. On the right side of the LCD display, below the red track arming buttons, you'll see a button there called Track. And on the track screen, the first screen, you're going to see the 16 tracks that you have. You're going to see a little bubble that says I above it for the input being monitored. If that's the case, there's also an M column for if the track is going to be muted and playing back and not playing back. Tracks 15 and 16 by default will always be muted if you are in record. Once you go to record 9 tracks at once, all of the track playback will be muted, so you must monitor from the inputs. On the second menu of track, you see the selection of the virtual tracks. The number 1 column is the default. But if you've done a good take on a track and you want to keep it, but you want to take another pass, then simply move the highlighted bubble over to a different number you wish to record on. The first track is going to retain its information. It just has a little outline circle around it, but now the second track is active. This is the stereo track screen. This is the meter you use for gauging the levels of the stereo track to be recorded to CD when you're doing the actual mix down to stereo. You will notice that the meter here looks a little bit different, shows you a lot more resolution. You will also notice a display of the tracks as they're being recorded. They show as 2 stripes. There is a small bubble to the left with an M above it. Once you press enter on that bubble, it becomes clear, and now the 16 tracks are muted. The stereo track will play back. It will play back through track faders number 1 and number 2, along with all of the adjustments you've made to those tracks. They don't play back clean. To get a clean stereo track playback, unmuted, press the Q button up to the left of the red track arming buttons. The stereo track button will flash. Select that, and now the stereo track will play without encumbrance out the monitor outs and be controlled only by that volume control. The stereo fader will no longer have any effect on it. You will also notice a stereo track erase box to the right of the stereo track display. If you wish to redo your stereo track, you can only have one of these. There are no virtuals. Then we recommend that you erase the track that you have done to make sure that you don't wind up with little bits and pieces left over at the end of it if you actually fade out of your song a little bit early.